Keiser. Welcome to On the Edge. Time now to go to Los Angeles and speak with Nomi Prins, former senior executive at Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns. She's the author, of course, of It Takes a Pillage and her most recent work, Black Tuesday. Nomi, welcome to On the Edge.
Thank you.
All right. Nomi Prins, you write, quote, "The largest banks hold deposits," that's our deposits, "hostage in the global game of financial warfare." Explain.
Well, in order for all of these banks to make all of the bets they make, they have to have something behind it. Not a lot relative to the size of the bets they make and the derivatives positions they take, but certainly something. And that something is our money. That something is our deposits. And it has been since the beginning of banks. But the difference is, more recently, our money is much more hostage, as I say, to much larger moves and speculation in the global financial warfare game. And it is a game to them because they don't put up, i.e. the heads of these banks, their own money. They might have stock in their own banks, but they're not putting up their own money to the extent that we are putting up our money behind their bets without having a say in what bets they take. And that's the current structure of the banking system. It has been. It's just worse now because of the size and just maniacalness of what's going on.
All right. Well, this problem was evident during the crash of '29. You've written a book about it, about the Depression. And FDR came in and he brought in Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, backing deposits with federal insurance. And so why is it different now than during this period of the FDIC? The deposits are insured and depositors are getting made whole. I guess up until all the way up until about 2 months ago when J.P. Morgan stole the MF Global funds. Is that kind of the beginning of a post-FDIC period, Nomi?
Well, here's the thing. Understand the FDIC definitely backs the depositors, back the deposits of the citizens of the country who had lost a lot of money straight up. Lost it, could not get their money out of banks as banks were failing. And one of the things that the Glass-Steagall Act did afterwards is create this FDIC to ensure those deposits, to make sure that banks did stupid things and made dumb bets and wasted, all of that the depositors would be safe. But the thing is, that FDIC was created as kind of also a carrot to the banks, because what the banks did in order to have that backing for their deposits so that they could do other things is do less of them. They had to split into firms that traded, speculated, created securities, dumped these securities onto the market, lied about their integrity in their reports and everything else. But those transactions, that business was separate from taking deposits and making loans. That's how it was up until 1999 when the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. After it was repealed, banks could go back to what they had been doing in the 20s, which is just bet like mad, lie, create securities, flush them into the world, and when they lost money, they had depositors to sit back on. Now that is the case again. The difference is that now we do have an FDIC to back those deposits, but the ratio of the bets to the deposits is crazy. If you look at J.P. Morgan Chase, they hold a notional position of over $70 trillion worth of derivatives. They will tell you it's all hedged. They will tell you it's mostly netted out. We know that's not the case because we know they can make dumb bets and lose a lot of money in a second. We also know that they have only $1.8 trillion of assets, which include deposits. That's a tremendous ratio of less than 2 to 70. That didn't even exist in the 20s. That is new now. So what we're dealing with now is the destructuring of the banking system after 1999, the allowance of these banks to do whatever they want in a huge derivatives market, of which the top 5 banks in the United States control 96% of the U.S. derivatives market, and it's sort of the same globally. The biggest banks, the 10 biggest banks, control basically all of the derivatives activity in the world, which is $700 trillion worth, and they can do all of that with, in the United States, backing for their deposits. So it's like they can bet more now in a safer environment for the banks in a too big to fail sort of way than in any sort of proportion to the 20s. And we saw how that wound up.
Okay, so this results typically in bank runs, and we're now seeing bank runs in Greece. We're seeing the beginnings of a bank run in Spain. Nouriel Roubini in the Financial Times editorial section has warned that Europe is experiencing bank runs that are becoming out of control. We saw bank runs in 2008 in the UK at Northern Rock. So is it correct to say that as a result of this instability and the breakdown in all the measures that were put in place to safeguard depositors, that we're entering a period of ever increasing, ever bigger bank runs? And where will we see these bank runs?
Well, I think we're even seeing in the United States, not runs per se, not like we had back in California when we had a few years ago after the Northern Rock run in the UK, we had bankers outside of Pasadena, banks trying to get their money out. It's because people want to be safe, and people do not believe, and certainly rightly so, in the case of Greece, in the case of Spain, in the case of Portugal, in the case of Italy, in the case of the US, that the best place to keep their money is in banks. Now, even though we do have insurance, we also know, and MF Global is not a bank per se, although it is an agent of the Federal Reserve like banks, so it had a lot of the same cushiness that banks had, and it had customer money, and it used that money to back its own bets. And this is something that banks continue to be able to do. This is what happened in Spain to a large extent with what happened in the housing crisis that is going on now in Spain and is continuing, and all the defaults on loans and everything else. And a lot of those were to speculative developments, which are standing half or totally empty. That's all money that banks put into a speculative drive, and people want to take their money out so that when everything caves, as it is doing, they are not liable. They weren't responsible. Someone takes a loan and they can't pay their loan because it was overinflated on a house, it was overinflated by the way the system works. That is one thing, and that's not a good thing either. But it is also worse to have your money, whether you are in any country in Europe or in Asia or in Latin America or in America, behind a very unstable betting system, an unstable casino. And that's what we have. It isn't, and in the United States, there are fees that banks charge us to keep our money, to allow them to bank. It is negative to people to keep money, for example, in a savings account at JP Morgan or Citigroup or Bank of America. You are paying the bank to take your money to bet. It's insane.
All right, let's talk about somebody that you just mentioned there, JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon. He was revoted to Class A New York Fed Reserve Director. Now, he's also the CEO of JP Morgan. He's also involved in a pretty salacious scandal with MF Global. What about the conflict of interest there? Should that have been allowed to happen? Should have been allowed to be revoted in as a New York Fed Reserve Director?
So in the height, really, of the crisis in February 2010, Jamie Dimon, who had already been a Class A director of the Fed, New York Fed, was revoted in to continue that role. And Jamie Dimon, in the Fed world, in the Wall Street world, has this aura of godness that also the media picks up and everything else. He was considered the man who was least likely to screw up the markets, who was most able to manage risk. And on that basis, he got revoted in. Now, there have been New York Fed directors since the beginning of the New York Fed, since the beginning of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, that have come from the banking industry. It has always been a conflict of interest. It has always been the equivalent of, Fox watching the hen house, all of that, because you have the access as a Class A Fed director to be in those meetings, to talk about when to raise rates, to talk about when to guarantee loans, to talk about bailouts, and to basically talk your own game. And that's what Jamie Dimon could do there. That's what in the late 20s, Charles Mitchell, who was then the head of Citigroup, what at the time was called National City Bank, was doing into the crash. He was trying to keep rates low so he could keep cheap money, so he could keep his bets going so that he wouldn't fail. And then his bank secondarily wouldn't fail. And he was in the position to do that. Jamie Dimon is now in the position to do the same thing. And that is what he is doing. He is not in there talking about regulation and framework and how to beat this banking system into some sort of compliance and some sort of order. He's not doing that. He's trying to talk about how we can all police ourselves. And what we have seen is that the equivalent of policing ourselves in banking is to be thieves.
Right. On the JP Morgan front, Jamie Dimon and MF Global, JP Morgan has allegedly returned several hundred million of the billion or so they stole. Temporarily. They held on to that money for 7 months, however, presumably speculating and balancing some black holes on their balance sheet, and they had free use of that money for 7 months. Your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and as we've seen, as part of what happened in those 7 months, they lost some amount between 2 billion and 5 and 10 and whatever it is they're not saying on a bunch of bets that occurred in the quote chief investment office of the bank, where they were basically betting their own money, but they called it investing instead of betting. What they were doing and what they said when they created that office was using effectively their funds, which are depositors' money. And at that point, they were also MF Global customers' money, because as a creditor to MF Global, JP Morgan was able to get first dibs on any money it needed to keep the credit lines going, as MF Global's bets, as John Corzine's bets, were failing. And that's what they did. They held on to the money. They held on to it while they needed it. And now they're kind of giving bits and bits back. But you know what? If you're like a regular person and you walk into a bank and you steal a boatload of money and you get caught, you don't get to say, oh, I'll give it back in 7 months. You know, everything's cool. You get arrested. You get charged with felonies. You're a grand larcenist. You go to prison. And in this situation, it's like, no, never mind. We have it for a while we sort things out or whatever, or use it for other circumstances, which they can, because the regulators don't really know where all of the money's going. They are way behind the banks, and that's what happened.
Well, I think clearly in the United States anyway, the money in circulation is the property of the Federal Reserve. As an individual person, if I have a $100 bill, that's not my property. That's not my private property. It's the property of the government. Until that is fixed, then J.P. Morgan and Jamie Dimon, working with the Fed, will always just assume all the money in circulation is his money. I mean, I can understand why he would think that, because that's the law. The law is that the government owns the money. We don't own the money. They do. Jamie Dimon does own the money. He operates with impunity because that's the way the law is structured.
Well, no, he is the Fed. It's not even like there's any separation in impunity. He is, as we just talked about, he is the Fed in all aspects where he has control over that money. So yes, and that's why the entire banking system is so corrupted, so risky, and so bad right now, and historically at worst levels, because again, in the 20s, when this was all the case as well, and when bankers like Jamie Dimon, at the time it was Al Wiggin who ran Chase, were betting against their own firms, and putting money in offshore accounts, which at the time meant Canada, and now it means all sorts of other things, Channel Islands, Jersey, whatever, that you have a situation where, yeah, there is no hand slap, there's no felony convictions, there's nothing, because you're operating in the system that you lobby for, that you control, and that you're a part of, i.e. you being Jamie Dimon and the like. So we really need a massive restructuring of the system, which unfortunately everyone who is involved in keeping it the status quo will push against that, and does push against it. And so if someone comes up with an act, and for example, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont came up with an act that he introduced in Congress a couple weeks ago called the Federal Reserve Independence Act. And it was very, very simply saying that directors of banks shouldn't be directors of the New York Fed. It was a first step. He could not get a single person from across the aisle or even very much support for this act. He did have a couple senators on it, but it's a very logical act. Why should we have those two things combined? What purpose does it serve? It only serves to enforce the status quo of risky banking at our expense.
All right, now digging into the details of this latest crime wave involving J.P. Morgan, on your site, nomiprins.com, you also write that J.P. Morgan's London whale, as he's called, was essentially the same bet made by John Corzine. Explain this, and what does it tell you about the intelligence of the guys running the banking system? Do they not see the disaster that they have wrought?
Yeah, well, first of all, starting with that, they don't feel accountability. They don't feel remorse, because in this system, they don't have to. In this system, when they make a mistake, it's a mistake. I'm sorry, it's a mistake. I didn't mean to. In John Corzine's words, I didn't ask for those funds to be misused. That wasn't my direction. And Jamie Dimon's, we made an egregious mistake. They sort of hand wave all these things away like it's just the course of natural business. Stuff happens. It's unfortunate. We move on. And in the case of MF Global and JP Morgan Chase, what JP Morgan Chase did was they effectively bet that U.S. credits corporations would improve over a certain period of time, more in the near term. And when they put that bet on, they did it in something called a synthetic derivative, which basically they just bet against an index of derivatives where the side of their bet was betting that things would improve very quickly in the U.S. corporate market. Now, John Corzine did the same thing with respect to the European markets. He made a bet on the peripheral European countries and Belgium. I don't know why he threw Belgium in there, but whatever. And he made the bet that governments would continue to bail them out, that their banks would be able to refunnel that money because they would get most of the money that goes into these government bailouts and cheap loans that are received through the ECB and through the Fed, and everything would be fine. Why one can't read the tea leaves when you've talked about for years how there is a continued global depression, degradation, decline of banking infrastructure, of economies, of finance, of everything else. Why these people can't get that is I think two things. One is there are complete egomaniacs, and two is they don't bet with their own money.
Yeah, and they call this asymmetric hedging, which of course is an oxymoron. Either you're hedged or you're not hedged. The law says that they're not allowed to make directional bets under Volcker rule, so they simply make these directional bets but call them a hedge. And clearly that's a misnomer. They're just saying that to skirt the law, correct?
Right, they're saying it to skirt the law. And the fact that they can even call it a hedge and facilitate the trade that is a trade and not a hedge, but for speculative purposes, is because they can. The Volcker rule hasn't been fully realized, but even so, there's so many ways, and this is just one example pre it being realized, that banks can just pretend they're doing, quote, God's work, to use a phrase from Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman Sachs, and they need to do things because they need to rearrange the funds they have to increase global development or whatever it is they call it. They have all sorts of shiny words for this on their websites, and they're helping and they're distributing and all this kind of stuff, when in fact they're really betting. They don't make money on simply taking deposits and giving out loans. They don't make money on traditional banking. They make some, but they don't make the kind they can make if their bets go right. And again, because they have no reason not to bet, they continue to do that.
All right, Nomi, let's talk about the D word. Your latest novel is about the Great Depression. You write in the latest Trends journal that we are now in a depression. Why won't the press and politicians call it what it is? And is by not calling it a depression, is that adding to the mayhem, the misallocation and the mispricing of assets?
Yeah, I think the press, certainly politicians, don't like to call things depressions because that means they won't get reelected. No one wants to preside over a depression. I mean, look what happened to President Hoover, and he hemmed and hawed for a while as to whether to call it a recession or depression. He chose the word depression because it was different from the Great Recession, which had happened prior, but he lost the election massively to FDR. And so that's one thing. Leaders don't want to admit that they have screwed up, as much as each one of them is contributing to it, the national and global economy. So there is that. The press is just really stupid. I mean, the thing is, what these people are doing is they're perpetuating this sense of value to ordinary people of the markets, whether it's stocks or bonds or whatever else, by not calling this what it is. And in depression, things continue to get depressed. And that's really what's happened. Wages, jobs, all of that has been depressed. The housing markets have been depressed. If there's a little bump in the stock market, a lot of that speculative funds from financial firms that are, again, using other people's money or leveraging it, which isn't the same thing as investing it in productive companies. And all of that are signs of depressions. And if you look at the figures between what we're experiencing now, and I go through a lot of that in the Trends Journal piece, and to what was happening in the 20s into the Depression and in the 30s, we're not really that far off. We have similar levels of unemployment in terms of actual stats, not official Washington stats, and certainly underemployment and people who just can't make life with what they have. We have over 50 or 40% youth unemployment throughout many countries in Europe and growing. We even have growing unemployment in some of the Asian countries. And so, and that's just starting. I believe this is a global depression where the first aspects of it were the U.S. and Europe, and that's been trading off. And then it's going to slow down the Asian economies, and Latin America, which is the last bastion of investment right now, which is where all these banks are piling in, because where else are they going to make the new bet? Let's go somewhere we haven't pillaged yet this time around, and that's what is happening there. But it's all on fluff. It's not on real production. It's not on real value coming from people with jobs and being able to afford things. It's on a completely depressed economy, and so therefore it is a depression. And the fact that no one will admit that in the power channels is because it makes them look bad, and then they can't continue what they're doing.
Nomi Prins, I've been listening to Barack Obama. He made the suggestion that Europe must now provide capital to their weak banks. Now, isn't that kind of what got us this disaster rolling? Shouldn't we let weak banks fail who make bad bets? And isn't this just going to add to the growing catastrophe?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing, Obama, whether he doesn't understand finance or pretends not to, it almost doesn't matter. And same thing with Tim Geithner, Ben Bernanke, the whole team. The fact is that these banks, again, have speculated, have leveraged money they've had, loans that they've had to do other things that are much worse. If you look at some of the worst banks right now in Greece and Spain and so forth, a lot of the loss there is not because of individuals not paying their loans, not because of major default rates and delinquencies from people, but because even when people are involved, the bigger problem is that things were overinflated by speculation. Money came in, and international foreign speculative capital came in, went out really quick. That's the mark of any kind of bubble, and then depression or degradation afterwards. And that's what we have now. And what we did in the United States, what the Fed did and what the Treasury Department did, they decided that we just need money, whether it's 0% interest rate, whether it's quantitative easing to keep the illusion of treasuries up and rates down, whether it's the balance sheet of the Fed being several $trillion, whatever it might be, to try and keep this thing going. And that's what got us into this mess. The difference is, into this mess, rates were higher. Into this mess, these banks had to some extent, not rely on 0 or near 0% money to get them out, and that they could leverage further to keep the bets going. So we're actually in a worse position now with this philosophy than we were going into this particular era.
Right, and at this stage of the Depression of the 30s, we were already into the Pecora Commission investigating the bad bankers, and during this Depression, we haven't even gotten to first base. We haven't even started to realize that we need a Pecora Commission. We need to investigate the bank and the fraud on Wall Street, so we're still a long way off from even the beginning of the end, much less the end of the end. All right, Nomi Prins, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the edge.
Thank you.
Okay, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank my guest, Nomi Prins. You can catch up with her at nomiprins.com. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.